Hi, welcome back. All right, so this is part two of our first lesson in chapter two. It's a long lesson and there's a lot of new stuff coming at you. So we're still looking at organic compounds in this lesson, but in part two of the lesson, we are looking at more of the functional groups and other types of organic compounds other than just the alkanes, alkenes, and alkynes. So the first one that we're going to take a look at is called a benzene or a benzene ring. And so most up until this point, we have been looking at these long lines or linear shaped compounds. And I'm just going to get another color here for us. Chains basically is what we call them, but now we're going to look at these benzene rings. So we're going to see these in a lot of the compounds that we're exploring today. And so ring shape, benzene. So what are these rings? So they have a hexagonal shape. They can be represented by any of these three different kind of diagrams. And this is because right now, so you can see there's a double bond, a single bond, double bond, single bond, double bond between each of the carbons. So there's 6 carbons and they alternate double, single bond. Well, technically that double bonds, they kind of move around. It's called resonance. So they're kind of moving around. That's why we use this kind of circle to show that. But there is 1 hydrogen on each carbon. So you have a general formula for a benzene ring of C6H6. All right. Now these rings are really strong. All right. They're very stable and strong. They're not easily broken down by chemical means or biological means. So if they get into the body, they're not broken down. So we call these persistent organic pollutants. PC POPs, POPs, POPs. Okay, you might see that term persistent because they aren't broken down, and they're organic because they contain carbons and hydrogens. But they're considered pollutants in many cases, especially when they're not able to be broken down. So you'll find these things like toluene in gasoline and plastics. There's an example here of xylene, which found in rubber and cements, and naphthalene. Look at this, there's 2 benzene rings. So you'll find this kind of a compound in bug repellents or fungicides. Again, so they're very stable, which is great for some things, but not great if you want them to be broken down and degrade in nature. Okay. So some of the problems with benzene, because it found in the fuels, if there's a fuel spill, we can get benzene leaking into our drinking water. So we have to be very careful with benzene. The problem with benzene, if it does get into the drinking water, if it's consumed, it's carcinogen. Okay, that means it causes cancer. It causes mutations in our DNA, and I'll show you why in a second here. You might find benzenes if there is incomplete combustion. Remember that? Incomplete combustion of fuels and gas. You also might, if you burn your steak or something, you can find benzene on there. Different types of benzene. Benzopyrene is found in the black parts of meats, and it can cause mutations as well in your DNA. And why is this? It's because look at these rings here. Don't they look very similar to the structures in DNA, the nucleotides in DNA? So these benzene rings or PAHs, let's just see, did we have that? There. I was under my picture here, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So basically multiple, poly means many, cyclic means circle, aromatic is those benzene rings, and hydrocarbons. So PAHs is what we're referring to these compounds that have lots of different benzene rings, and they can mimic parts of the DNA and cause mutations in our DNA. Okay. So we looked at benzene rings, and now we're going to take a little bit more of a look at some of these other organic compounds. For the next couple lessons, we're going to be looking at these, but they're also on your chart on page 9. And first off, for this lesson, you just need to be able to recognize them, and we will do some namings in the next lesson as well. So first off is alcohol. So in your data booklet, you'll see alcohol there in green. There's an example of an alcohol. So you have the methane, and one of the hydrogens has been replaced by OH, oxygen and a hydrogen. So this is alcohol. This is the general formula for alcohol. You see the R group here? That means it could be any carbon, benzene ring, chain, whatever that hydrocarbon looks like. Big long substance, basically anything where OH is attached. So this is your alcohol. You can have an alcohol group attached to anything. There's an example here of ethanol, so a 2-carbon chain with an alcohol group added onto that chain, and we call it ethanol. And we'll look at naming of it another time. Right now, we're just looking at, can you identify it? So a carboxylic acid is our next one. So carboxylic acid, here's your general formula for it. So it could be attached to anything, but it looks like this: a carbon with a double bonded oxygen and a single bonded oxygen that has an H attached to it. This is a carboxylic acid. There's an example of ethanoic acid. Eth has 2 carbons, and here is the carboxylic group, the group that makes carboxylic acid a carboxylic acid. Okay, so it's on a 2-carbon chain. Then we have esters. Esters are a little similar to carboxylic acid, except you'll notice they happen in the middle of a chain of carbons. So there's a chain of carbons on one side and another chain of carbons on the other. And the actual ester group is a carbon with a double bonded oxygen and a single bonded oxygen. And there is what your ester is. So you'll see there's a group on one side of the ester and a different group or the same group on the other side of the ester. And we're going to look at naming these suckers next lesson. They're a little trickier, so we'll leave them for today. And lastly, the halogenated hydrocarbons, which is what we're going to explore more of today. Halogenated hydrocarbons, basically you can throw a halogen, an atom from the halogen group, so like chlorine, fluorine, bromine, onto any, did I miss one? Chlorine, fluorine, bromine, iodine, onto any of these hydrocarbons, and you get yourself a halogenated hydrocarbon. Alrighty. They do list those halogens that I just listed out in your data booklet on page 9, right underneath this chart. So make sure you find this chart and write down some comments about this chart in your data booklet. So one of the things you're going to have to be able to do is identify the functional groups. Can you find them? Really, you don't have to name this. You just need, like, this is a scary looking molecule, right? This is folic acid. It's one of the B vitamins, really imperative, essential to your health. So can you find the functional groups in here? Well, if you use your data booklet, you might see there's one. This is the carboxylic acid. Remember, wherever there's a bend here or where the lines meet, there's a carbon here. So there's a carbon, double bonded O, and the other way is an OH. So this is a carboxylic acid. There's another carboxylic acid I see, right? There's a carbon, OH group, and a double bond to the O. There's a benzene ring. We know benzene rings now, right? And look, there's an alcohol group, just an OH sitting there. So we were actually able to identify 4 functional groups in this compound. And here's another question. This is from an old diploma. So this is looking at aspirin. So there's the structure of aspirin. You actually have a benzene ring here. Here is an ester. Remember, esters show up in the middle of a compound. So you have a carbon double bond to an oxygen. You'll have a carbon chain on another side and carbon compound or something on the other side of the ester. And a carboxylic acid is here as well, and you'll see how this is always at the end. There's no more chain attached to it. So there's a carbon double bonded O and a carbon to a alcohol group. So hopefully you have your page 9 group chart open so that you can see this. I want you to be able to see that this is a carboxylic acid and this is an ester and what the difference is between those two. Again, can you identify the functional groups in here? What is this representing? The black is considered carbon, red is the oxygen atoms. You have a carbon, double bonded oxygen, single bonded oxygen, and then another carbon. So this is your ester. Okay, so it definitely helps to write in the actual atoms instead of just using the legend. Write in the atoms to figure out what you've got. All right, a little bit more about halogenated hydrocarbons. So these are where you replace a hydrogen atom by a halogen atom. So what are halogens? Those are chlorine, fluorine, bromine, and iodine. And some examples, you may have heard of CFCs. These are chlorofluorocarbons. These used to be used as refrigerants in refrigerators and air conditioners, but we stopped using these because they were depleting our ozone layer. And you've probably all heard about the ozone layer, but we're going to review the ozone layer and the importance of it and how these CFCs were destroying or are still actually destroying the ozone layer. PVCs, this is another example of a halogenated hydrocarbon. So these are polyvinyl chlorides. These are obviously have chlorine in them, but they're used in the plastic manufacturing. And then we have carbon tetrachloride. This is a cleaning solvent. You may have heard of it, and it's a very well-known carcinogen, so cancer causing too. Some other halogenated hydrocarbons. When you burn garbage, if you're incinerating garbage, it can release chlorine into the air, and that chlorine can be very damaging. We'll see that in a bit here. And then polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. You may have heard of those before. We don't produce them anymore. Up until the 1960s, they were used in a lot of different things, like in our electronics, coolants, engine oils, fire retardants, household paints, cement, caulking. But they were discovered to be very hazardous to human health. From the name PCB, or polychlorinated, poly means many, chlorinated, so it's got chlorine in it, and biphenyl. A phenyl is a circle group like a benzene. Bi means two. So if you look at some of these examples of PCBs, you'll see there are two phenyl groups or two benzene groups. Lots of chlorine, right? There's our chlorinated, polychlorinated. So many chlorines on two rings or two phenyl groups, however you want to remember this. And then we have dioxins and furans, and they're used in the pulp and paper industry, and I'll show you their structure in a second too. So these are all halogenated hydrocarbons. So here's dioxin and furan. So these are the byproducts. So we didn't really want to actually create these necessarily. When you see byproduct, they just happen as part of that chemical process, unfortunately. So in the production of iron and steel, or burning plastics, or chemically treating wood, like if we burn that, sometimes in power generation or tobacco smoke, and they've been linked to a lot of different things like skin disorders, liver problems, immune nervous system impairment, and cancers. So these are structures you should be able to recognize. You don't need to be able to draw them or anything else, but you should be able to have two of these beside each other and know that this is dioxin. Look at di means two. Ox sounds like oxygen, right? Two oxygens. And a furan just has the one oxygen. Now, all these X's here are either hydrogens or chlorines, right? Because we're still talking about halogenated hydrocarbons. So these are, dioxin has chlorine on all these different spots, or hydrogen, but has lots of chlorines in here as well. All right, so byproduct, pulp and paper, lots of industrial processes, byproduct. All right, you've probably heard of DDT before as well. DDT is also a halogenated hydrocarbon, so it's got chlorine in there, or other halogens. You can see from the name, dichloro, so two chlorines, diphenyl, two rings, right? And then trichloro, oh, another three chlorines and an ethane group. So you can start to read some of these names of compounds, and you can be like, hey, I know that word, or I know that word, and you start to identify what's in there, right? You might not be able to draw that one exactly, but you can identify some of the things that are there. So that's what DDT stands for. This was actually developed in World War II to use as a pesticide to protect people from malaria. A lot of people were dying from malaria, typhus, also protected people from lice and other insect-borne diseases. Unfortunately, and you can see they're like powdering up people like crazy. They're blowing it all over the beaches, and yeah, it's just all over. They're pouring and dumping it on kids' faces, down their coats. Anyway, unfortunately, they didn't know this at the time. But it affects human populations in a variety of other ways and can cause cancers, and it biomagnifies and does not break down. Remember, we learned about that with those phenyl groups, those rings. They are super stable, those benzene rings, and you add chlorine in there and they're super stable. They don't break down. They end up in the food chain and they biomagnify up the food chain, which I'm going to show you a little second here. So we did ban these in Canada and the US in 1970, but unfortunately they're still being used in some other countries. We're finding them in breast milk and everything too, because they're going up the food chain. Oh, there's the structure of DDT. You can see all the chlorines here and the 2 phenyl groups or benzene rings and chlorine. Anyway, I just want to get to the next page. Here we go, biomagnification. So this is what's happening with the DDT. It happens with other pesticides, dioxins and furans and heavy metals. Anything that can't be broken down, they get biomagnified up the food chain. So these stick in the fatty tissues and they're not released as waste. So they're not excreted out of the body. So they build up. So the water might have a small level of pesticide like DDT, but then the invertebrates take that in and they build up, and then the fish in the next trophic level of the food chain eat those, and then it's the organisms at the top of the food chain that really build up the pesticide or the halogenated hydrocarbon in this case, and that's why it affects mostly the top predators here. Okay, so we're jumping into the naming of these halogenated hydrocarbons. You do need to know how to name them. So it's the same way as we named the other things. We still follow the same rules. Step 1, circle and name the parent chain, the longest chain. Find all the halogen atoms. Determine the prefix necessary. Is it a chlorine that's been added, an iodine? How many of them? 2, 3. And then tell you where those atoms appear on the chain. So for the example here, the parent chain is, there's just 1 carbon in this compound. A 1 carbon compound is methane. All right. So we write methane. You can see methanes here. And then instead of hydrogens, we have these chlorine atoms that have been added. We have 3 of them. 3 means, or another way to say 3 in chemistry is tri. So we have tri, and they're called chloros. We don't put chlorine. We like to abbreviate things, right? There's our abbreviation, chloro. So we got trichloro or 3 chloros. And there's only one place these chlorines could be because there's only 1 carbon. So we don't need to put any numbers in front to tell everybody where on what carbon, because there's only 1 carbon possible. Okay. Over here, let's take that hydrogen off and put a fluorine, and you'll see, I don't think I can move that guy. No. You'll see now you've got the trichloro, and then we have a fluoro. So we only just put fluoro. We don't have to do 1. We don't have to say 1. We just write fluoro. If there was 2 fluoros, we would put difluoro. So trichloro, fluoro, and then methane. Trichlorofluoromethane. Woo. Here's another example here. Here is 4 chlorines on a methane. So now instead of tri, we call it tetra. Tetrachloro, so 4 chlorines on a methane. Tetrachloromethane. Okay, here's a good example because this one is example 4 does not have a methane. We are now dealing with ethane. So now we have to say where all these chlorines and fluorines are, right? So we're going to number this carbon 1 and this is going to be carbon 2. And we know it's an ethane chain. There's only 2 carbons in it, so it's ethane. On carbon 1, you've got 2 chlorines, so dichloro. And, right, and then a chlorine over here. So we've got actually 3 chlorines. So that's where the trichloro, so 3 chlorines. So 3 chlorines. And where are these 3 chlorines? Well, 2 of them are on carbon 1. So there you go. Carbon 1, and then 1 of them is on carbon 2. So you need a number for each chlorine. So chlorine on carbon 1, chlorine on carbon 2, and a chlorine on carbon 3, and there are 3 chlorines. Whew. All right, let's try this again with the fluorine. There are 3 fluorines, so it's trifluoro. And then where are the fluorines? There's 1 fluorine on carbon 1. There it is. And then on carbon 2, there are 2 fluorines. So carbon 2 has a fluorine and carbon 2 has another fluorine. So again, a number for each fluorine to indicate which carbon in that chain they're in. Alrighty. And we do write chlorine first before fluorine because it comes first in the alphabet. That's the only reason. All right, so ozone and CFC. So we just sort of did a molecule called CFC there. CFC is chlorine, fluorine, CFC. Oh, actually, the chlorofluoro. Oh, it's not there. But anyway, so these are chlorofluorocarbons, so carbon compounds that contain chlorine and fluorine. All right. And these are concerning to us because they damage our ozone layer, and our ozone layer is very important to us. So these CFCs were used quite a lot in refrigerators, aerosol, if you had hairspray cans back in the 70s and 80s. They were all in there, fire extinguishers and stuff. But they were banned in 1987 through the Montreal Protocol. You may have heard that that protocol before, but they banned all CFCs as an international agreement that everybody agreed to because they were damaging the Earth's ozone layer. So we've talked about ozone before in terms of smog, and we have ozone at the level down here at the like where we are. We don't want ozone down here. Down here, ozone's bad. It's damaging to our health. So it's considered a pollutant down here. Up here in the upper stratosphere, super high up, it's super important. It's the good stuff. That's what protects us from the ultraviolet light coming from the sun. Without that protection, we basically too much UV light, and we're going to get a lot of mutations, skin cancers, and other major problems. So that ozone layer, super important for human health if it's way up high. Okay, so there's a great ozone layer up there. Unfortunately, we released all these CFCs that went up to that ozone layer and have been destroying that ozone layer. And they're focusing kind of over the poles too, so the North and South Pole, and that's where the focus of the destroying of the ozone layer has occurred. So when these CFCs come into contact with UV light or rays, they break up, and the chlorine atoms are what are causing the problem. So they go and they react with the ozone, this O3, oxygen 3 there, O3, and they break that ozone into just regular oxygen and an oxygen atom. And then they keep doing it. Like the chlorine doesn't go away. It keeps doing it. So it says that there's an estimation that 1 chlorine atom can remove 100,000 ozone molecules from the atmosphere. So like it's a never-ending thing. And that's why, like, even if we've banned CFCs, they're still up there, still destroying the ozone layer because they're persistent. They just keep going. Yeah, and excessive UV radiation, which is what's going to happen if we have no ozone layer, leads to skin cancer and cataracts and a variety of other issues. Yeah, so actually there's a little mention about this Alberta Swan Hills Hazardous Waste Treatment Facility, and it uses these really high temperatures, so it's got to be above 1200 degrees Celsius to break down these stable rings, CFCs, PCBs, all these things that we're talking about that are really persistent and damaging in our environment. The only way we can break them down and get rid of them is at these insanely high temperatures so that they don't get released into the atmosphere and the water systems. So yeah, give these a go. So now, like, this is a question from an old diploma exam, and some of the hints here, you start with what you know for sure or what you remember, and then you might be able to find the ones that are missing. So there's some pollutants here, and then their associated sources. Where are they coming from? So see what you can remember. So we just talked about CFCs. And you hopefully remember that they were in refrigerators. They were a refrigerant. I like to remember pesticides. There we go. Pesticides from agriculture runoff. Okay, that makes sense, right? Even if you haven't learned anything about them. I did mention pulp and paper industry. Dioxins are a byproduct of the pulp and paper industry. And then PCBs, if you go back, you'll see that they were part of electronics, old transformers, that kind of thing. So that's where those are coming from. But, as long as you can pick 3 of these out, you can find some of the other ones and maybe match them up. Okay, so this is just making sure you understand. So it's the chlorine atoms that are regenerating in CFCs, so they just aren't getting destroyed. You keep having that chlorine atom that keeps destroying more ozone molecules. All right, and that's the end of our part 2. So it's quite heavy, lots of content in here. Make sure you spend lots of time on your practice questions and your self checks and ask questions when you don't understand.